Hey there, I'm Lori. Welcome to my sewing room. Today I'm working on a quilt for a client who wanted a twin size quilt for each of her two little girls. Now she shared with me an image that uh, was sort of what she wanted, and I used that as my starting point, and I'll post that picture up here when I edit. Obviously, when you see the inspiration, it's a very simple pattern, but she wanted a twin size quilt, which means I would have to add some some things around it to get it up to that size. And if you see, the inspiration has a very large initial in the center, which I could easily do with applique. The name below that I can do with my embroidery module. Since this is really a very simple, what I would consider a beginner quilt type pattern, I thought I would take you along with me and show you how I make it. I've already made the first of the two, and that's how I was able to figure out the measurements that I'm going to share with you today. So I'm going to show you how I make the second one. So let me show you the first quilt so you can see what it is that we're going to be making. So this is the quilt that we're going to be making. It's the first one that I made so that I could work out the measurements. I have it laid out on the bed in our guest bedroom. I just took it off the long arm so you can still see the lines that I've drawn on it with a water-soluble marker. But those will come off when I wash it. Now, as you can see, let me get a little closer. There are 3 rows of squares above and below the center panel, and then 2 sets of squares on either side of it. Then I have an inner border followed by the scalloped border and then a really wide outer border. And I did the wide border because I'm trying to get it to a twin size, which is about what it ends up being. One thing to notice also is I did add a very narrow 1-inch border to the top of the scallop border so that the scallops would really stand out. I was afraid if I put the wide border right on top of the scallops that they would sort of lose their prominence. Another thing to point out is that although this quilt is very pink, since that's what my client wanted, you could easily adapt this pattern for a boy or for any child that just isn't into pink through your color choices. Now I have about 8 or 9 different prints in this quilt, but you can use as many different prints as you like. You just need 48 squares, and then you need the leftover fabric for the scallops. I used a variety of fat quarters and a few half-yard cuts, because when I used a fat quarter, with the fabric that was left over after I cut my squares out, there was enough left over for me to use to make the scallops. So that's what we're going to make today. Okay, so fabric requirements. So you'll need 48 6.5-inch squares. And depending on how much variety you have in your prints will determine, whether you want to use fat quarters or half-yard cuts or less. But like I said, you'll need 48 of them. For the white fabric, which includes the center panel, the inner border, and then the white fabric that I used to make the scalloped border, you're going to need about 2.5 yards of white fabric. And then you're going to need about 2 yards for the outer border. Now for the backing fabric, I used a 108. Because I don't like to have seams in my backing fabric. And when you buy a 108, you need a lot less yardage. So I only needed 2 yards of a 108 to do the backing of this whole twin size quilt. Now, I did have to get a little bit creative because since this lady wanted pretty much an all pink quilt, there weren't a lot of choices. I mean, I could have bought something online, but I didn't really want to wait for something to come in the mail. Um, and so I went to my local stores and I found a few pinks, but I didn't really care for them. So what I ended up doing was I got a white on white, and since I always pre-wash my fabric anyway, I put in a couple of tablespoons of liquid Rit dye, red, and put that through with it in the washing machine, and it came out a really pretty pink fabric with the white print showing up as white. So it ended up being a really nice option for the backing fabric. So once I have my quilt laid out on my design wall out in the hallway, the trick is getting them sewn together without getting them mixed up. And the only way I find I can do that is to take one row down at a time, stack them up, and stitch them one at a time, and then put the row up, and then take the next row down. That prevents me from doing chain stitching, which is a little bit more efficient time-wise. But it's very frustrating when I get myself all confused as to where the fabric went before. So I just stick with this method for now. And then for my seam allowances, I will press all of them one way on the top row, and then the others will go the other way, and so on. And then they nest nicely. Okay, so let's get started sewing. When I reviewed this footage, I realized that it's too shaky, so I'm just going to show you the best view I can of what my squares look like when I have them arranged and stitched together. I have the top 3 rows together, and then the 2 side panels, and finally the bottom 3 rows. And next I'll show you how I made the center panel and explain what other options that you have if you would like to do something different than just an initial. To make my center panel, I've cut my fabric at 12.5 by 18.5 inches. For the letter applique, I went on Google and did a search for a black line letter A. Once I found a letter in the style that I liked, I copied it onto a Google Doc, but you could also use a Word document. And then I made it as large as the page size would allow. Then after I printed it out, I laid a sheet of fusible interfacing on top of the printed letter, and I traced around it on the bumpy side. I used a Pellon product called Wonder Under, but there are other products out there that work just as well. It's important to remember to trace the image on the bumpy side, that's the adhesive side, so that your letter won't turn out backwards. After you trace the image, you rough cut it out, iron it onto the back of your fabric, and then cut that out as exactly as possible and iron it onto the panel of background fabric. Then you stitch it down with a zigzag stitch or a blanket stitch, whichever you prefer. Now, this is where you can get really creative, because if you don't want to do the large initial, you could do some other kind of image, like an animal or a Disney character. You could also embroider the child's name by hand if you don't have an embroidery machine. Just draw out the name with a water-soluble pen and embroider it with floss. In my case, I'm going to embroider the child's name with my embroidery module onto the fabric before I do the applique, because I think the applique might get kind of messed up when I have to put it into the hoop for the embroidery. All right, so I have put all my portions, my 3 parts together. I've got my center panel with the squares above and below added to it. And the final measurement of this section of the quilt is about 36.5 wide by 55 inches tall. So the next step is to add my inner border on. So for the inner border, I have cut 5 strips of fabric at 3 inches wide because I want the finished size to be, when it's sewn into the quilt, to be 2.5. So I've got 5 strips, and with the measurements that I have, that should be plenty. To make the scalloped border, you're going to cut your printed fabric at 3.5 by 5.5, and just use whatever variety of prints that you have left over from your squares. Then you're going to cut, and you'll need 40 of these in a variety of prints. Then you're going to need double that amount, so 80 of the little squares for snowballing the corners. And these are 1 3/4 by 1 3/4. I started out using 2 inches, but I felt that that gave me the scallops that were a little too pointy for my preference. But you know, feel free to play with that if you want. So 1 3/4 inch squares. And so what you'll do is draw your line corner to corner on each of your squares. And since this is going to be the stitch line, I just use a regular pencil. I mean, you can use a friction pen or a water-soluble pen. It doesn't matter, but I'm just using a pencil. So draw your line, and I find that snowballing the corners is very easy, but it's deceptively easy. And so what I used to find is that my corners didn't always come out quite right. And this is where it really matters to be as precise as you can to stitch as close to the line as possible and to pin as carefully as possible. It's a small square, and so it would be tempting to not pin, but I find that as the fabric passes under the machine, sometimes the fabric will shift, and I try to line it up as exactly as possible so that no fabric is showing on either side. And then I pin it in such a way that I don't have to remove the pins as I sew. And then when I stitch slightly above the line, slightly to the right of the line, because when you fold the fabric back, you are going to lose a thread or two into the fold. So I try to position my needle so that it's touching the line, but it's above the line. So like maybe a thread. And I find that that gives me a pretty accurate, you know, corner square triangle. All right, so now I'm going to stitch these and show you what that looks like. If you can see if that'll focus. I guess it's not going to focus. So it's just barely to the top part of the line. And what'll happen is when you fold this back, you'll get it to be exact. See how that comes up exactly to the top of the corner, and that's what you want. So I always finger press it before I hit it with the iron, and that gives me a little bit more accuracy. So now when it comes time to press, so I'm going to press that up. All right. Okay. So now when it comes time to press, I'm going to press this seam allowance up, and I'm going to press this seam allowance down. So this one is up, this one is down, and so when I stitch these together, I'm going to line these up. It meets up, and this one's going down, and it just nests and lays very nicely. As you can see here, I've sewn the scalloped border on all 4 sides and added the corners as I showed you. The corners should line up with the top and the bottom sides of the scallops. Take your time with this part, and this will add a lot of charm to your quilt. So we've got the inner border on and the scalloped border, and then along the scalloped border I have added a very thin 1.5 inch, which when it's finished will be a 1-inch border, so that the scallops can really stand out. And now the only thing really left to do is to put on the outer border and then get it up on the quilting frame. Now, to cut your outer border in a length of fabric cut, you need to wash and iron your 2 yards of fabric into the same fold that it had when it came off the bolt. Then you'll fold it in half lengthwise, making sure to line up your edges as well as you can. We're making a border that is 8.5 inches wide, so you may have to use multiple rulers as I'm doing here. First, make a lengthwise cut to even up all your outer edges. You do this by making sure that one line of your ruler is lined up along the fold, as I'm showing you here. This will help you avoid having a bend at the fold when you unfold it. After you cut off the edges, you'll make 2 lengthwise cuts 8.5 inches apart. This will give you 4 length of fabric cuts that are 8.5 inches wide, and that will be enough for each side of your quilt. Here's the finished quilt top with the outer border on. It measures 65 by 81, which should allow for about a 10-inch drop on a twin-size bed. I think the scalloped border gives it a little extra charm, and I really think that my clients' 2 little girls will really love their new quilts. So that's it. It's a very simple, beginner-friendly quilt, and I hope that my explanation of it made sense to you. I did create a written pattern, and I have uploaded it in the description box below as a PDF, and that way you have easy access to all of the measurements and the fabric requirements, so you can download it and print it out and save it for the future. If you have any questions about anything that I said, please be sure to put those in the comments below and I will respond. And if you found anything useful here, I'd appreciate it if you'd give me a thumbs up, and if you're new, I hope you subscribe. So until next time, I'll see you later. Bye.